Hello everyone, I'm Maurice Karp and I'm here with my colleague Francesca Zambon.
Hello.
To talk about the Decameron's moment of glory at the time of the COVID-19 crisis.
Hello, we invited two experts to join our conversation today, Professors Ronald Martinez and Massimo Riva. So welcome, professors. I'm gonna introduce Professors Ronald Martinez, who has published extensively on Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Ariosto, and Machiavelli. He's the co-editor with Robert Darling of the Oxford University Press edition of Dante's Comedy. He translated Italian plays and literary criticism. His current research focuses on Dante's poetic valorization of early modern technologies. In addition to Dante and Trecento studies, his research interests include Renaissance drama and cultural history. He also published articles on the afterlife of Boccaccio's Decameron in Italian comedy, on the role of rhetorics and politics in the Decameron, and on Boccaccio's reception of Dante. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I'm going to introduce Professor Massimo Riva. Welcome.
Thank you.
Massimo Riva is the chair of Brown University's Italian Studies Department. His research and teaching range from Boccaccio's Decameron to modern and contemporary literature, film media, and the digital humanities. He's currently at work on a digital monograph, a pilot project of the Brown Digital Publications Initiative, funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And he's the co-editor of Decameron Web, which is today the only digital resource available for the study of Boccaccio's Decameron, where users are able to navigate material pertaining to the historical, literary, and cultural contexts of the Decameron's production and reception.
Perfect. So I think we can start, and maybe we can start with you, Professor Riva, with this question. So during the past month, the Decameron not only has entered the top 10 of Amazon bestsellers, but it also inspired online readings, art projects, and for example, we saw the Triennale Milano's project, Decameron Studying Streaming, and also literary debates. So how is this book relevant today, and what are the parallels between the 14th century Black Death and the current COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting us to talk about, it's a pleasure to talk about an Italian classics. And, you know, classics are always contemporary, as Italo Calvino said in Why Read the Classics, and they speak to us across centuries. That's why we read them and reread them. But here at Brown, we have actually witnessed firsthand this renewed interest for the Decameron. And as you know, the Decameron Web, the project you just mentioned, which happens to celebrate this year the 20th anniversary since its first major NEH grant. So it's an old project, our pioneering project. So this website was conceived in order to disseminate knowledge of Boccaccio's Decameron in the early age of internet, and specifically to promote collaborative reading involving students and general readers as well in virtual communications with one another. So it is a very appropriate tool under the present circumstances. And we have noticed a spike in hits, as we say, on the Decameron Web. We received many emails inquiring, in particular, inquiring about one section of the Decameron Web devoted to the plague. While we cannot say that the Decameron Web has gone viral, we are pleased with this renewed interest. In fact, as far as the plague is concerned, this is the first element or the first parallel in answer to your question between the time when the book was conceived and written and the current context, the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are several parallels, and I'm going to mention a few. So first of all, both the Black Plague and COVID had their origin in what is modern China. Of course, that at that time in the medieval times in the 14th century, when Boccaccio wrote this book, China as a national entity did not exist. So let's say Eurasia, the center Eurasia was the place where this pathogen of the Black Plague, Yersinia pestis was the Latin name, originated. And the second parallel is not only this origin in Central Asia, in what is modern China, but also the fact that the pathogen jumped from an animal to a human. And of course, for Yersinia pestis, the pathogen was carried by fleas nesting on rats that traveled along merchant routes in what was the early age of the globalization. So yet another parallel, if you wish. So on a different level, on a social level, I would say, a striking parallel is the ethical dilemma than the 10 young Florentines imagined by Boccaccio face in their decision to temporarily abandon Florence, the city, and retreat to the countryside in the middle of the plague, reproducing to some extent the current conditions of lockdown and stay home. We will see more in detail later. Speaking of which, as a slightly weirder side effect, I was recently interviewed by a trendy magazine for an article whose title somewhat synthesizes what is perhaps the most frivolous aspect of this renewed interest in Boccaccio's book. The title goes, "Decameron and Chill, Why a 14th Century Italian Masterpiece is on Everyone's Coronavirus Reading List," with a reference to the meme "Coronavirus and Chill" that suggests a supposed increase of romantic activity because people are cooped up together. Well, as we shall see, there is indeed a parallel to be drawn to the erotic theme of many stories in the Decameron, although it is not exactly what this journalist had in mind. It is the parallel between the plague and love sickness, perhaps less evident with COVID than it was at the time of HIV/AIDS, another time when the Decameron became a bestseller. In fact, a prominent Italian writer who also happened to be gay, Aldo Busi, rewrote the Decameron at that time from a non-binary perspective. The idea that in the Decameron, the real pandemic is related to the consequences of love is both disturbing and illuminating. After all, love is the ultimate form of proximity, of togetherness. And as a social bond, as a passion, it is the ambivalent binding agent of social trust, sorely tested as we speak in our pandemic.
Some interesting sidelights on this. One of this is that of course, the path that the plague took from Central Asia to Italy was along the Silk Road. The caravan routes that brought the wealth of the East to Italy and contributed to the prosperity, of course, of Florence and the northern Italian commercial cities. And that, of course, was also the route that the plague used to arrive. So it's interesting historical irony there, one thing. The other thing is that, in fact, Boccaccio mentions very often in the Decameron, Genoa, Cyprus, and he also mentions Messina, which were known to be the points at which the plague entered Italy. Whether that is scientifically corroboratable, I don't know, but it's an interesting point that Boccaccio was probably very deeply aware of how, in fact, the plague had made its way to Italy and its intricate involvement with the wealth of his own native city. So I just add that as a corollary there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Martinez. So the 1350 epidemic of plague in Florence appears in the frame narrative, unifying the 100 stories of the Decameron. How does Boccaccio represent the experience of sickness in his book? Beyond the escape from the danger of the plague, what can Boccaccio teach us about staying close to the diseased and taking care of them?
Well, you say unifying the 100 stories, and that's an interesting word to use because once the Brigata gets to its villas on the tops of the hills, there are almost no direct references to the plague in the entirety of the Decameron. Of course, part of the whole idea is to forget about it. So they don't want to talk about such things. They want to have fun, relax, enjoy themselves. And there are actually only 2 precise references within the whole Decameron to the plague, One of them is they remember the death of someone they knew, Nonna dei Pulci. And in the second case, they notice that the animals, this is near the end of the book, they notice that the animals are very tame, and it's because there are no hunters to hunt them, because hunting has been erased, in a sense, by the plague. And then finally, one sort of oblique reference, Boccaccio says near the end that his brigata either will have conquered death, or death will not conquer them, or they will receive death with joy, suggesting that this whole experience, and this is near the end of the book, has given them a kind of larger understanding of life, or something that will allow them a kind of philosophical serenity before the likelihood of dying, in a sense. But that's very little that's actually directly about the plague. Now, as Massimo just mentioned, there is this whole other sense in which the amorous experiences are connected with lovesickness, this very widespread understanding in the Middle Ages. It's in the medical textbooks of what it means to be lovesick. And it's a malady that often leads by itself, without any plague, to death. So that's a way, indirect way in which death works its way into many of the stories in the Decameron. And of course, there's also lots of deaths, poisonings, deaths of violence. And Boccaccio also is fascinated with medical practitioners of his day. And there's a lot of medical material in the Decameron, and even some pharmacopoeia, right? There are stories in which we learn things about how diseases might be cured or produced. So that's the way the plague is an indirect presence throughout the Decameron. Think of Ciappelletto, the very first story. He dies of a disease. It's not the plague. Actually, Boccaccio calls it something wonderful. He calls it il male della morte, you know, the death that's for everyone. Then the second part of your question had to do with care. Here again, there's not much that Boccaccio says about taking care of the sick, because again, they want to get away from the sick. And in the early part of the introduction, as you know, Boccaccio describes the lack of care, or else the fact that care takes strange forms. Servants take care of their masters in intimate ways that might produce scandal after the plague is over. There is a trend that goes through the stories, however, of compassione degli afflitti. This, again, the idea that compassion is a value. And this pops up in a lot of stories. In the story of Landolfo Ruffolo, for example, he's shipwrecked. He lands on the shores of Corfu, and a peasant woman shows compassione for him. Boccaccio uses the word and takes care of him. This happens in a number of stories. So compassion is a value, even though Boccaccio doesn't explicitly link it necessarily to taking care of the sick, which basically he sees as being absent in the case of Florence. I guess that's more or less what I have to say about that issue. Yeah, Massimo?
Yes, no, excellent. In fact, I think you touch upon probably what is the one of the core issue, if not the core issue of the Decameron that has not been explored enough by critics. That is the fact that the plague is actually removed from the stories, that there is this contrast between the introduction and the actual stories. And as you said, because they want to forget about it, the 10 narrators, the 10 members of the Gentile Brigata. So we are faced with a paradox. On the one hand, the plague dominates the Decameron, you know, in fact, shapes the very structure of the book. You know, the frame story, the story of the 10 narrators. And then it disappears, except for those few mentions that Ron recalled. About compassion, well, the famous sentence you quoted, it is inherently human to show pity to those who are afflicted, is in the author's foreword. In introduction, not the introduction, sorry, but the foreword, the dedication to the women in love, the ideal readers of the Decameron. And the compassion the Boccaccio actually speaks about is not for the victims of the plague, although it could be extended to them, but rather for the victims of love sickness. So again, I'll go back to this connection between love sickness and the very idea of literary therapy that the book in sort of embodies to some extent, because it, as I said, it is the core of the book, of Boccaccio's book, and it is related to this rimozione, remotion. I mean, how do you say, substitution of the plague of substitution of love sickness for the actual plague.
Thank you. Yeah, always talking about the frame narrative. So we already mentioned that a group of 7 young women and 3 young men flee from Florence, from the city, and take shelter in a countryside villa near Fiesole. So Professor Riva, what does Boccaccio's book tell us about escape and isolation in our contemporary society? And also what differences and similarities in terms of social privileges and disparities emerge from a reading of the Decameron today?
Yes, the decision of the Brigata to abandon Florence and retreat to the countryside can be interpreted in at least 2 different and somewhat opposite ways. So the 10 narrators in the introduction debate the pros and cons but it is an academic discussion to some extent, because the author Boccaccio has already decided for them. So they're going to go. On the one hand, this retreat to the countryside from the city, this abandoning the city, escaping the city, can be seen as an escape from the common destiny, of those who similar to those the escape of those who can afford this luxurious shelter, like rich New Yorkers who were able to flee to their vacation homes, and eluding the lockdown. But conversely, this could also be seen as a kind of utopian move on the part of Boccaccio, so reflecting the desire to rebuild together an ideal society away from the city. Interestingly enough, a society built upon some kind of social distancing, within the dynamic of the Brigata. They sing, they dance, but their interactions don't go beyond that, don't go beyond the sign of reason. And the sign of reason sort of draws some sort of a limit to the amount of interaction that can happen among these 10 young Florentines. They create a sort of a immunitary situation for themselves in both sense of the word, as we'll come back perhaps to this meaning of the word immunitas, as has been evoked in contemporary debates by the Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito. So the utopian move. So storytelling is a pastime for them, is a game and a pastime. It is also a way to imagine a new world out of the ruins of the old. And these 2 meanings, or these 2 intention of the work, the escapist, and if you want, the attempt to rebuild the world, an image of the world that is realistic and to some extent, is an antidote as well. There is a tension between these two intention within the body, the texture of the Decameron. Because the question to conclude is, what is exactly the role of literature in the Decameron, and who benefits from it? We could perhaps remember that in the early 1970s, Pierpaolo Pasolini, erased the 10 narrators from the picture. He, in his film, Decameron, replaced Boccaccio's Cornice with a different frame story, whose protagonists are the homosexual thief and murderer Ciappelletto, or already mentioned by Ron, the worst man who ever lived, as Boccaccio defines him. So a definition somewhat reminiscent of Nietzsche's ugliest man, the man who killed God and thus spoke Zarathustra. Ciappelletto is celebrated as a saint in the very first story of the Decameron, a paradoxical demonstration of God's infinite love and wisdom. And it chose such a devil to intercede for humanity. Clearly, this can also be read as an allegorical reference to the plague, if you wish. If God sent it, even a blasphemous, allusion to the plague. If God sent it, the plague, perhaps even this evil must be part of His inscrutable providential design for for saving humanity to some extent from their own sins, etc. The other character chosen by Pasolini for his frame story is the painter Giotto in the film played by Pasolini himself. So why this substitution? The frame story, doing away with the Brigata and replacing it with this new frame story with two characters, a murderer and an artist, a painter. But well, beyond the autobiographical reasons, there are at least two broader motivations. First, erasing the Brigata, Pasolini removes the book from its Florentine gravity center, moves it down south to Naples and the southern Mediterranean. But also, this geographical and linguistic shift has also an ideological meaning, because erasing the Brigata means also erasing the point of view of the elites that to Pasolini ideologically distorts the representation of the Decameron world, as in the meaning, and also distorts the meaning of its literary therapy or remedy. Interestingly enough, Pasolini focused on the stories that featured a conflict between lower and middle classes and celebrated sex as a liberating subversive force, proletarian force, a position that Pasolini himself refuted a few years later in his abjuration of the so-called trilogy of life, the Decameron, followed by his adaptations of the Canterbury Tales and the 1001 Nights. Here I see a possible critique of the equivalence established in the Decameron between the plague and love sickness also, because Pasolini concluded that love cannot be a liberating force in a neo-capitalist world in which it is a tool of the ideological and biopolitical manipulation of bodies and desires. And compassion itself, the cathartic dimension of the Decameron, becomes ideologically suspect for Pasolini. In short, I mean, Pasolini's interpretation provides us with a provocative critical lens for a reading of the Decameron today in the time of COVID. So we also have to redirect our point of view from ourselves in our own more or less comfortable virtual lockdown towards those who cannot afford a safe social distancing, who are also actually confined out in the real world, trying to survive and paying the consequences.
Thank you, Professor Martinez. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, well, Massimo, I just wanted to recall that there is one moment of social disruption in the Decameron. In the beginning of the sixth day, there's a quarrel that's in the servants' quarters between Licisca and Tindaro about whether a certain woman went to her marriage a virgin or an experienced lover. And this causes a huge fracas, makes a lot of noise, everybody gets involved. And then there's a sort of trial, and they decide what decision has to be made whether Licisca is right, because she concludes that the woman was not a virgin when she was married, and Tindaro takes the other position. And then Dioneo is asked to solve the problem, and he favors Licisca. And Licisca then unwittingly furnishes the subject of the seventh day of the Decameron, which is the day when the women obtain revenge on their repressive husbands. So it's an interesting moment where the sort of the understairs, as we say in English, right? The servant class erupts into the surface of the aristocratic group and actually helps to change the Decameron, because the whole seventh day then is determined by Dioneo's decision. So there is a certain amount of, social movement there, in a qualified sense, of course. Anyway, just in a sense, it sort of follows on what you said about Pasolini.
Oh, absolutely. It reminded me of Downton Abbey to some extent. Your reference to the downstairs and the upstairs, the same dynamic, although in different social settings, but similar, right?
Thank you. Yeah, I think, it's very important to answer and think about these questions if we want to think about the Decameron today. So thank you for your example, Pasolini and the others. That was great. Maybe we can go back to the dedication, the poem of Decameron. So Professor Martinez, in the poem, Boccaccio states that he writes primarily for women in order to provide them, and I quote, with succor and diversion, and to free them from their condition of segregation and exclusion. So can you comment upon this, and how are women portrayed in the Decameron, and more broadly, what is the importance and the function of the poem itself?
Which is a really tough question, and the audience of women and the disparity between male agency and the lack of female agency goes throughout the whole Decameron. It's very interesting. Boccaccio follows this topic throughout and plays out in many ways. Again, especially in day 7, as I just mentioned, where this group of women, in fact, some of whom are technically confined to their rooms. I mean, Boccaccio really follows up on that from the proem, manage to find a way to escape that confinement and join with their lovers. Despite their husbands, who are often, carefully watching, but nevertheless are hoodwinked and deceived. It's interesting that this topic is said to be imposed on the Brigata by Dioneo, and initially the women of the Brigata resent it because they think it will make them appear in an unflattering light. So there's an interesting tension about it. The whole argument about whether Boccaccio is fundamentally a misogynist or a pro-feminist is an enormous one. We can't really go into it. It rages on. There are still, arguments from both points of view. But just to sort of simplify matters, the female characters who stand out and obtain a kind of consensus of approval, you might say, from the Brigata, but also in a sense from readers over the ages, are those who stand up for themselves in some form. You could think of Gismonda, whose defiance of her tyrannical father Tancredi is a breathtaking moment, even today, to read. Caterina da Valbona cleverly hoodwinks her parents so that she can bring her lover into her sleeping porch. Madonna Filippa forces a change in the laws of Prato, adopting a principle out of the Justinianic code that those who are affected by laws should have some role in making them. Obviously something that goes down to the consent of the governed in the United States Constitution. And in several cases, there are women with professional skills, usually medical skills, like Giletta di Rabona, who cures the king's fistula and therefore wins herself a noble husband. So there's social movement, in a sense, in a story like that. So there are an interesting gallery of female characters who seem to be put in a positive light and to have considerable amount of agency. The importance of the proem, well, the proem, Massimo has anticipated this, it thrusts the figure of the author, Boccaccio, the figure of the author, into the themes that the book raises more generally. He is like a Filostrato lover in the sense that he has suffered deeply in love. He's been hurt badly, but he's recovered. He's a recovering lover in the sense that we talk about alcoholism today. With the help of others. But this portrait of the figure of Boccaccio has to be balanced against other portraits of the figure of Boccaccio in the book. When he makes his defense at the beginning of the 4th book and also at the very end of the book, he sounds, and also in his proprietary story, the story of Filippo Balducci, he sounds much more like a Dioneo than like a Filostrato. And Dioneo, again, is the mischievous, the disruptor, as we say today, the one who likes to turn things on their heads, to create chaos in a sense, to complicate our responses to things. So the figure in the proem, in a sense, yes, it's one side of the figure of the author, but I think we're left with a more mischievous Dioneo-like figure of the author at the end of the collection. So that's how I respond to that. Massimo?
Yes, no, absolutely. All you said is quite true. And to follow up with going back to the poem, of course, so the poem establishes Boccaccio's ideal readers, the women as ideal readers, and they are cooped up in eternal lockdown, if you wish, because that's where they are kept while their brothers and fathers, etc., travel the world in their on the merchant routes, etc. Their only course for them is to read, or to in fact to be sort of in a state of boredom, between boredom and love sickness. So much of the Decameron is written tongue-in-cheek. It is up to the reader to draw the lesson. But as applied to women in love, the book in particular can be interpreted as both an antidote against erotic excesses and a love manual. So if you wish it, translating in terms of illness as both a vaccine and a virus. So an ambivalence that can be traced back to its classical models, Ovid's Arsamandi and Capellanus de Amore in particular. But on a metaphorical level, going back to the parallel between this idea of literature as both a remedy and a disease, and establishing a parallel with the concept of immunitas that I introduced before, immunity, as Roberto Esposito has argued, is also the inoculation of a pathogen into the communitas, the social body. Indeed, there is even a precise textual analogy between love sickness and the plague in the Decameron. Boccaccio compares them both to raging fire. In the foreword, where he writes, and the only translation I have is the Guido Waldman's translation, but it goes, it is women who timorously and bashfully conceal love's flame within their tender breasts, who know well enough how much harder it is to control the suppressed than the open flame. And in the introduction, where he describes how the plague gathers strength and as it was transmitted from the sick to the healthy through normal intercourse, just as fire catches on to any dry or greasy object placed too close to it. So love's inflammation is one of the physiological forms that the devastating plague's fire take within the body of the Decameron. The book seems designed to both quench and stoke the fire to some extent.
Perfect.
I can add one thing. Also, the location of the buboes on the body.
Yes.
Part of them are in the groin area, so that's another physiological precision that Boccaccio adds to that. Yeah.
Thank you. So maybe going from the poem to the actual novellas, we were wondering, Professor Riva, so what is the social function of the novellas as a literary genre, and also the act of storytelling in the Decameron? So in other words, should we consider the act of telling stories a mere form of entertainment? What could be the function of storytelling today during this time of lockdown, limited possibilities of aggregation, and the disappearance in a way of a public space?
Yes, I mean, I think I sort of hinted to the fact that the Decameron poses interesting questions about an idea of literature as an escape, and reading as an activity that can be done while safely sheltering away from the world, and as an opportunity to look at the world we inhabit from a distance. Of course, we don't need a special circumstances like a pandemic to do that. And I could argue that reading is always an act of self-isolation. In the Decameron, as I mentioned before, storytelling is a game and a pastime and an exquisitely social activity. And indeed, the Decameron is a perfect blueprint for a liberal arts college activity, you know, or setting. So the 10 narrators play the social game of storytelling in a safe space. In fact, this was also the inspiration of our Decameron web, based on a role play that combined in-person, in-class conversation with virtual tools. Students reading the book would assume the role of one of the narrators and discuss and interpret rather than simply tell the stories told by the narrator from their own point of view, as though they were their own stories. Of course, when I teach, I assign myself the role of spokesperson of the author of the, you know, in the book. But the combination of orality and literacy, communicative proximity and distancing, is reflected in the complex nature of the Decameron as a literary text that embodies an ambivalent idea of literature, as I said before: entertainment and useful advice, realism and escapism. So as a pastime, storytelling is also part of the sentimental education of the Gentile Brigata. The reader of the Decameron, twice removed from the characters' narrators, 3 times removed from the author, also benefits from this setup, from this shifting point of view from one to the other level. For example, through the narrators, the reader is supposed to derive both pleasure and wisdom from the description of the passions, the human passions embodied by the characters. There are tears in the Decameron. Many stories draw compassion for their protagonists, victims of blind fortune, chance, or their own passions or greed or foolishness, love. Yet laughter is the best expression of the therapeutic value of this comic pastime. And laughter in the Decameron is often pitiless, almost sadistic, as in the Calandrino stories. The Calandrino is the butt of many jokes, is the proverbial fool. To Pasolini, to go back to Pasolini once again, the comic element is clearly related to class. The laughter in the Decameron as a cathartic element, together with compassion, reflects an intention with compassion, reflects the ideological distancing embedded in an aristocratic point of view, as well as at times a proletarian, conversely, a proletarian mockery of it. Ron mentioned before the servants, and the kind of element of low comedy they introduce in this setting. In his film, Pasolini insisted on the latter, the proletarian mockery, as a kind of unmediated laughter. Indeed, throughout the book, there is a clear tension between the comic mode and compassion. As a literary game, storytelling is clearly a privilege of the ruling classes. For the proletarians who act in the stories, the characters, the protagonists, or the victims in the story, it is often a matter of survival.
To pick up on something that Massimo said before about the notion of a kind of utopian idea of reconstituting society, one of the reasons for the very elaborate system that Pampinea sets up at the very beginning is to create a kind of order where all order had been previously destroyed in the city of Florence. And that includes a complete disruption in activities, in rhythms, in sequences, in rituals. So the kind of very elaborate system that is set up under which the stories are told is itself a kind of therapy that's being brought to bear to reconstitute a society. It's interesting that when there's a debate about how they're going to spend their time, and some people suggest, well, we could play games like chess. And then somebody says, no, chess is zero sum. Chess is a game where there's a winner and a loser, and that could cause tensions. We want to do something in which everyone can participate without there being a kind of zero sum system involved. Although I think, as Massimo was pointing out, in some of the stories, especially the Beffa stories, which dominate the last few days of the Decameron, that is just precisely what happens, in fact. And whether, my take on that is that Boccaccio is anticipating the return to Florence and to that kind of world, in a sense. But anyway, so that's just, I would add that to Massimo's remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Martinez. So let's focus a little bit more on this dimension of the storytelling, because in a certain sense, we can say that the Decameron is the story of telling stories, we could say. So, Professor Martinez, this collection of short stories, or in general, the collection of short stories as a literary form implies mechanisms of suspension and cross-references that can be seen as strategies for killing time. Can we consider this genre, in a certain sense, as a predecessor of seriality in TV shows?
Well, this is one that I would rather have dumped off on Massimo, because I'm not sure, I don't understand that cross-references are strategies for killing time in your question. Boccaccio doesn't use cliffhanging kinds of situations in most of his stories, although he does link days together sometimes. Very often the last story in a day anticipates the following day's subjects or topics or themes. So there are linking structures between the stories. I don't know if that's what you had in mind. And again, later in the book, in those Beffa stories that we mentioned earlier, he brings back the same characters over and over again. There are almost half a dozen stories which bring back Maso del Saggio, Buffalmacco, Bruno, and Calandrino, who are this group of underemployed artists who are, making a living daubing walls in Florence and basically engaging in various kinds of practical jokes played on each other. So that starts to create the idea of a series, if you wish, of a kind of a narrative that goes from one story to another. The subject and the topic of which might be, as I was suggesting earlier, this kind of representation of a society constructed around the beffa, around tricks played on, and this kind of harsh, sadistic laughter that Massimo mentioned. So that's what I get from your question. I'd say in a larger sense, one of the things that we're still studying about the Decameron is the enormous amount of integration in a book that on the surface looks like it's a collection of 100 completely unconnected stories. You might, and I think it's still treated that way by many readers, but in fact, the level of organization of the book and of the individual days is very high and still bears focused study. So that's I just wanted to throw that in, and then I'll pass this one off on to Massimo, who knows a great deal about than I do.
No, I agree with everything you said, Ron. In fact, it's interesting. The serial element in the book is formally provided by the frame story, if you wish, and from the imperfect symmetries, of the stories themselves, imperfect symmetries, as Franco Fido once defined, rather than a progression or but the frame story is more a container than a narrative plot or lead, or from this point of view, the seriality of the Decameron is very different from that of the Orlando Furioso, for instance, Ariosto, Orlando Furioso. So the Decameron is more a labyrinth in which we are constantly immersed. The framing device is probably meant to provide the reader with a sort of a back and forth, a place where to go back to in order to take off again in a different direction. A formula that might work better on PBS and Netflix, I would say. So, but any adaptation for TV would have to develop the cornice, the Brigata story into a real story, something that would clearly horrify Pasolini.
There is, of course, the fact that there are suggestions throughout that there are romantic liaisons between members of the Brigata. These never materialize. They are left as a kind of bait for the reader. The ballate that are sung, each member sings a ballata at the end of each day. These are often indicate some sort of profound sentimental attachment. We never find out what's going on in that. But I suppose if you put it on TV, that would be an opportunity to develop.
I hope not, because one of the films that have been adapted for the camera is all about the love relationship among guest game of who is in love with, and it's a total disaster, betrayal of the film. I agree.
Okay, so let's not speak anymore about this temporal dimension of the storytelling in Boccaccio in order to avoid disasters of adaptation. And let's focus instead on the spatial dimension of the Zibaldone, like of the Decameron, how are spaces represented. So in the Decameron, the closed space of the villa where the protagonists withdraw in order to flee from the plague leads to the open space of narration. The stories of the Decameron develop in a wide spatial dimension that reflects the geographic awareness of the late medieval period. Can we read the Decameron as a book of encounters? And how does Boccaccio portrays culture and places that are far from him? Professor Riva.
Okay, how many hours do we have? I know, because this question clearly would would require crossing the book as a whole. But let me say just a couple of things about space and time, and in the Decameron, perhaps Ron might want to address another part of the question that I cannot, for sake of time, address. So space and time are related in the narrative world of the Decameron. In fact, I would say intimately related. So in the enclosed garden of the book, the 10 narrators open their narrative windows, if you wish, on a wide world, geographically and chronologically. In relation to space, many scholars have emphasized the almost global reach of the Decameron. The Americas and Australia are excluded for obvious reason. But almost all the other continents are there, or at least the known parts of those continents. One of the most successful collaborative activities we pursue with our students in the Decameron Web is the mapping and geolocating of the stories told in the Decameron. The visualizations derived from this mapping show how the book has actually two centers. One is Florence, of course. The other, an expanded one, is the Mediterranean basin, crisscrossed by merchants, adventurers, pirates, and lovers and their stories. Perhaps the Silk Road, departs from the lower Tyrrhenian, Adriatic coast, might be also another interesting, route. But the Decameron narratively discovers the Mediterranean 5 centuries before its official literary invention in the 19th century, Alexandre Dumas and others. So the Mediterranean is both the setting and the driving force of many stories in the Decameron, often as an objective correlative of fortune, chance. Boccaccio, the sea, the ocean. Boccaccio had a vast geographical culture for his time, and also wrote a geographical treaty, the Montibus, now being translated into English by the Decameron web co-editor, Mike Papio. In relation to our topic, it is this contrast between the enclosure of the virtual garden, the safe haven in which storytelling takes place, and the wide horizon of the world with its variety of human cases, destinies, life and death, etc., to provide a parallel with the lockdown condition of COVID, in which our windows are computer screens, TV sets, and those bring the reflections of the world into the safety of our homes. As far as time, I would only mention that the time is perhaps at the core of the past time as a pharmac, as a remedy, as a therapy in the Decameron. Many have noticed how time slows down, how it seems that time never passes in the lockdown condition. And at the end of the day, one realizes that time flew away. And here I see an analogy with another book that makes of time the very subject of a reflection about sickness and health in all their bodily and moral or spiritual dimension. I've been rereading The Magic Mountains by Thomas Mann, as you know, takes place in the intensely social isolation of a sanatorium in the Alps. But the ambivalent slowing down and sudden acceleration of time or suspension of time is connected by Mann specifically to the malady at work within the bodies and the souls of his tuberculotic characters. And equally in the Decameron, I think there is a therapy of time at work, along with the removal of the plague as the subject of stories, its substitution with love sickness as an important temporal dimension in the Decameron. The present time of the pandemic, described in the introduction by the author, the very realistic description of the plague is only the backdrop to the story, like the macabre scenes, piles of cadavers illustrating some contemporary chronicles, Sercambi or Villani, etc., or a famous fresco in the Camposanto in Pisa, painted by one of the characters in the Decameron, the painter Bofardacco.
Thank you, Professor Riva. Professor Martinez, would you like to add something?
Well, yeah, just to follow up on what Massimo just said, at the very end of Pamphilo, who is the king of the final day, at the end of the storytelling, he says, well, we have to decide what to do now. We've all had our turn. But then he invokes the sort of the classical description of the virtue of prudence that looks at the past considers the future and considers the present and anticipates the future. And he says that based on my use of this virtue, it's time now for us to return to the city, because if we don't, certain unfortunate things might happen. But therefore, there's a setting of the limit then to the time spent in exile or in lockdown, so to speak, and the need then to reopen, in a sense, find the moment to actually return to the city. And so it's a very specific issue then for Boccaccio, I think. Just added a little to the historical, Boccaccio actually rides a wave of exploration of the Far East, for one thing. You know, I mean, not only Marco Polo, who we haven't mentioned, but, you know, who is just a few decades before and who becomes quite popular, of course, and quite often copied. And the Franciscan missionaries who go to the Levant and also to Mongolia and are Florentine Franciscans, and then return and publish large books about the Mongol Empire. This is, you know, Boccaccio was riding that wave of serious exploration and information in the early Trecento. So,
thank you very much. So now moving, so from these geographical aspects to the, let's say, to the place of the Decameron in the history of literature. So Boccaccio comes after Dante's Comedy and Petrarch's Canzoniere, and his Decameron is, in a certain sense, the first book of vernacular prose that becomes a classic all around Europe. What is the influence, the legacy, and the afterlife of the Decameron in the history of literature? And also, given the foundational role that in a certain sense it has, could we say that Western literature is fundamentally a plague literature? Professor Martinez.
Well, I mean, it would be impossible to overstate how influential the Decameron has been. If we just start with framed collections of stories, of novelle, we have the Pecorone, the 300 novelle in the Trecento, Paradiso degli Alberti, the Porretane, Masuccio Salernitano in the Quattrocento, Ecatomiti, Geraldi Cinzio, Bandello in the Cinque. I mean, in other words, these are just the highlights of a tradition that continues well into the Seicento, the Conto degli Conti, Chaucer's we go to England, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Painter's Palace of Pleasure in 1586, an important influence on Shakespeare, Dryden's Fables Ancient and Modern in 1700. In France, Marguerite de Navarre, L'Heptaméron, La Fontaine's Fable, all over Europe. And these are just the highlights of an incredibly rich, and that's just in narrative, because Renaissance and Baroque drama in Italy and England, to a slightly lesser extent in France and Spain, would be vastly different and much poorer without the novella tradition that Boccaccio sets in motion. And that, of course, includes, as I said, Shakespeare, who a number of whose plots derive ultimately from Boccaccio stories, though not immediately. And also the chivalric romance. I mean, chivalric romances are filled with insertions, novelle-like insertions, Boiardo, Ariosto Tasso, and others that are either directly or indirectly derived from Boccaccio. You might think in England down to the Romantic period, Keats's celebrated version of Isabella and the Pot of Basil. Poe's, in this country, Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death, one of these plague stories that's recently been acquired new popularity. The list is endless. You'd have to include erotica as well. You know, until the 20th century, in the Anglo-American world, if you wanted a copy of Boccaccio, you ordered it, and it came to you in a brown paper wrapper. So because people, you know, it was considered a work of illicit fiction. I'm not sure that this makes Western literature a plague literature, although their plague episodes appear in most Western traditions. I mean, Massimo just referred to, you know, the Magic Mountain, which might be considered certainly consumption was a kind of plague in the later 19th century in Europe and in many parts of the world. And many celebrated books, Defoe, Mary Shelley, Manzoni, Albert Camus, Catherine Ann Porter, all these have also shared in the popularity that the Decameron has enjoyed recently. What you might say, if I want to become a little bit grandiose here, is that from its origins, Western literature, and Boccaccio stands at the historical dawn of literature as taken for itself, without an express doctrinal or ideological program. It's had a special role with respect to the consumption of time. And I think we've already anticipated this topic. The consumption of time, which is often modulated with respect to the time available for leisurely reading, that is social class. So again, one of the needs of the leisured classes, beginning with maybe the 12th and the 13th century in Europe, is for long books to consume the vast amounts of leisure that the aristocracy enjoyed. And it's interesting that when you get to the urban cities, the commercial cities of northern Italy, literature has to get more economical. It has to become more efficient. You cannot have the prose Lancelot, which is 7 folio volumes. There's not enough time for that. So you have Dante's comedy, which is incredibly efficient, 14,000 lines, and it covers the universe and the afterlife as well. So, I mean, there's an interesting story to follow there. You might say that plague is an artificial interval that demands the consumption of surplus time. There might be a relation between plague narrative and prison narrative on this basis, with respect again to confinement, enforced discipline, risk of sudden death. Anyway, those are my speculations on your interesting question. Yeah, I'm sure Massimo has something to add.
I don't think I have anything to add, Ron. That was really a wonderful excursus on on world literature and more.
We have 2 last questions that we really want to ask. So for once, everyone is talking about Boccaccio rather than Dante. So during his lifetime, Boccaccio has always considered himself a fan of Dante. Compared to the comedy, we could say that the Decameron portrays a less spiritual and more concrete world. So, however, if we were to draw a comparison, would the Decameron be a purgatory or an inferno?
I have a very sort of programmatic answer, so then you can elaborate. I think if those were the only choices, I would have to say purgatory. But from another point of view, it's extremely clear that Boccaccio really wanted to face off against the entire Divine Comedy on his own terms. There are 100 stories there because there are 100 cantos in the Divine Comedy, at least that's one reason. And there are clear infernal, purgatorial, and paradisal aspects to the text. In the introduction, Boccaccio suggests the terrible account of the plague is an infernal sort of preamble that once you pass it will lead on to happier and better things. He compares this process to climbing a mountain. Arduous effort precedes, and later you come to the place of delight and relaxation. It's like Dante climbing out of hell, ascending the mountain of purgatory, and entering paradise. In the Trecento as well, Dante's comedy was interpreted as combining all the genres: tragedy, because of the infernal part, comedy, purgatory, and perhaps aspects of paradise, and satire, all the anti-clerical attacks scattered throughout the poem that you know very well. Boccaccio also makes an attempt to include tragedies, the fourth day, comedy, which is throughout, but day 7 is sort of generically defined as comedy. And then in day 10, he has a kind of ascensional paradise of magnificent gestures. On a deeper level, I could say, just as Dante's infernal dystopia mirrors the moral and political crisis of Italy in the period between the Battle of Montaperti, say, in 1266, and Dante's death in 1321, and it aspires to imagine the conditions of a different kind of civic order, the Decameron attempts to reweave, we said this already, a shattered civilization with narrative, with storytelling. And I think the reweaving is actually a useful metaphor given the importance of the wool industry in Florence. So that would be my programmatic answer to the question of Boccaccio and the Decameron.
Perfect. Yeah, we forgot about the paradise in the question.
Yeah. Well, from my point of view, going back to this parallel or analogy or intimate relationship between the plague and love sickness, I always thought of the Decameron as a purgatory, or better, even an anti-purgatory, as a sort of an ironic inversion of Dante's invention. The purgatory is considered to some extent Dante's invention in the, even for the Christian, his contribution to the Christian doctrine. But the clear allusion, that Ron mentioned to the mountain of purgatory in the introduction, the author's introduction. So, that sort of a distressing beginning, abhorrent beginning that the readers have to cross as travelers on foot, confront a steep, rugged mountain, etc. Specifically refers to the introduction, the description of the plague. Mm-hmm. But then the plague is removed from the stories. No? So, and where are we when we enter the Decameron, the actual Decameron? Well, when we join the narrators in the countryside, we are in the Garden of Eden, or in a simulation of the Garden of Eden, the locus amenus of storytelling. And then we, from there we go on excursions into the real world, and perhaps sometimes in hell, sometimes in other parts of the. But we are still on this earth, never in the afterlife, except for a couple of cases in which we cross the line. So now Dante, if you remember, locates the Garden of Eden on the very top of the mountain of Purgatory, and in their slow progression up the mountain over the decades and centuries they spend in Purgatory, so according to their sin, the souls, and Dante rushes up past them, have to cross Eden and its cleansing rivers, restore an original innocence in order to be allowed to take off for paradise with Beatrice, theology, etc. So in the Decameron, we are already, since day one, in an Edenic condition. So in a state of suspension, restored on earth in contrast with the hell that Florence is present under the pestilence. So replacing the plague thematically with love, sickness, and fortune, if you wish, conceived as a pagan, blind deity, not the angel of providence like in Dante, Boccaccio establishes a connection between malady and sin that is quite evident for the late medieval mind. Mortality is a sinful condition, and it's Eve's fault, of course. The Decameron is a thinly disguised critique of Genesis, Decameron, over 10 days, a recreation of the world in the double meaning of the word recreation. To the religious mind, the plague is punishment for our sin, hell on earth sent by God. What can we do if not endure, pray, and buy indulgences from the church to speed up the progression of our departed, beloved in the afterlife? So now, as an invention, this is the point. The purgatory is a church's instrument of ideological domination and economic exploitation, as the Reformation and also some suggestions from Franciscanism denounced. The purgatorial therapeutic dimension of the Decameron is antithetical to this. Storytelling and merrymaking replace prayer as the rule in the daily rhythm of the Decameron. Underneath it all is the idea that by describing human nature as is, with all its faults and all its variety, we can restore, if not Eden on earth, this belongs to a few privileged, if not a state of innocence or immunitas, at least a reasonable understanding of our own nature without moral hypocrisy. And this is, I see, as the ironic happy ending of the Decameron as an anti-comedy. Leaving their Eden, the Brigata will have to go back to the world after the plague. They won't fly to heaven, although we are not told what will happen to them once they leave their buen retiro. So the comedic dimension is not in the afterlife, but here on earth. So the young members of the Brigata, in an analogy with the situation will go back having prepared themselves to the world after COVID, not through prayer, but through storytelling, hopefully made wiser and more compassionate by the game they played in this Edenic retreat.
If I could just add, no, I agree with everything you say, Massimo. I was giving a more programmatic answer, but if one looks very closely at the novelle in which Boccaccio is most concerned to be encountering Dante, they're basically always a critique of the system of eternal punishment. In other words, in the story of the scholar and the widow, in a sense, in the story of L'Ostaggio degli Onesti, there is an implicit critique of Dante's harsh treatment of souls in the afterlife, in a sense. So I entirely agree with you on that. But of course, it's because Boccaccio is thinking about Dante all the time, and that's in a sense the bottom line, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's what is it? Anxiety of influence, to use an expression.
But it's a very productive anxiety.
Yeah, totally. Yes.
Thank you very much for this, let's say, wide look on the Decameron that emerges from this comparison with Dante. So now one last question before we conclude our conversation. Let's enter into the activity of storytelling somehow. Let me ask you, if you could pick a novella for these times of uncertainty, which one would you recommend us? Professor Martinez, you want to start?
Yes, I decided that I wanted the feel-good effect, considering we're locked down and we need things to cheer us up. So I've chosen the next to last story in the Decameron, which is a story of Torello and Saladino, which is a utopian story, to be sure, of generosity and understanding between magnanimous souls that overcomes geographic limits and religious differences. And at the end of it, there's a bit of science fiction as Torello is flown back basically to Pavia in the course of a night from Alexandria in Egypt. So it's a fast flight. And it also has a female character, Torello's wife, Adalieta, who is portrayed as having significant agency and her own separate relationship with Saladin. So, you know, it might even pass the Bechdel test, but, and also it's sort of the official summation of the Decameron in the sense that many of the topics that we've talked about, the geographical reach of the book, the question of women, and many others that I couldn't even think of, are sort of summarized in that story. And then Dioneo comes along as usual and throws everything into confusion with the deeply problematic story of Griselda. But anyway, I like Torello and Saladin. So Massimo.
Well, you should have gone last with it, because I would sort of play the strident note here. I actually picked a story which is not one of the best in the Decameron, but it's interesting in connection to our topic. So I would pick novella 7 of day 4, and the novella of Simona and Pasquino. And so day 4 is the day of tragedy, you know, as Ron has remembered, I mean, as recalled, and is also the day of sorrows, the day because the cruel king, the member of the Brigata, who is the king of the day, chooses the topic of the day. Filostrato, already mentioned, is an unhappy lover himself, has a grudge on happiness, and has imposed as a theme the stories of people whose love ended in tears. So it is also the day in which the substitution of lost sickness, egritudo amoris in Latin, for the plague is more apparent. So to Boccaccio, the real pandemic, I keep saying, is love sickness in its many exceptions. So Simona and Pasquino are two young proletarians in love with each other. With another couple, they go to a garden where they can be alone, but while their friends don't waste any time and start making love in a rather, well, proletarian way, Simona and Pasquino sort of hesitate. They really love each other. They rest next to a beautiful sage bush, and Pasquino, perhaps to clean his breath before daring to kiss his beloved, rubs some sage on his teeth and immediately falls ill and dies. So Simona is the only witness, and she's accused by Pasquino's friends to have actually murdered him. Perhaps a hint at witchcraft here. Brought in front of the judge, the only way poor Simona, as Boccaccio says, crazed with grief and terror, can defend herself, is to go back with his accusers and the judge to the crime scene and repeat the ritual. She rubs some sage from the same bush on her teeth and dies on the spot. So this sudden death without apparent logical explanation is marvelous in the sense of inexplicable, a monstrum like the plague. Yet an explanation is given in the story. And I quote, if I remember, beneath the bush, a toad of a remarkable size was discovered, and the bush had become infected with the poison of the toad. So Simona's innocence is recognized at the price of her life, and she and Pasquino are buried together, united forever in death. Their love will be celebrated, notwithstanding their social status. So here are the analogies I see with the current pandemic. The deadly infection jumps from a rather unpleasant animal in this case a toad instead of a bat, to humans, contaminating a plant, sage, whose medical qualities are celebrated in one of the aphorisms, the metrical aphorisms of the Schola Salernitana, Salvia Salvatrix, they call it, sage, the savior, Naturae Conciliatrix, no, the reconciler of nature, turning into a symbol of nature pollution in this case. As the first part of the Schola's aphorism has it, and it asks, why should a man whose garden contains sage ever die? And then there is an answer, sort of a sententia by way of an answer to say, against the power of death itself, there can be no remedy, whatsoever in gardens. So perhaps Boccaccio overturning the healing power of sage is also an ironic warning about unproven remedies, of course, but the most eloquent parallel I see with COVID is that the victims, its victims are the most vulnerable among us. In this case, not old people in shelters, but poor people, poor young people in love, poor young proletarian in love, who, in order to demonstrate their innocence, indeed, in order to become visible to society, have only one resort: to die. The two proletarian lovers, Simona and Pasquino, exceptionally entered the locus amenus of the aristocratic love tradition, but they pay dearly for it. In exchange, their love will be immortalized. We can pity them, have compassion for them appropriately. And our pity, to some extent, also absolves us. So this story shows all the radical power and all the ambiguities of Boccaccio's literary vision, storytelling as a form of therapy or homeopathic, treatment, but also as a form of elitist entertainment.
So with these two beautiful stories, we conclude our conversation. Thank you very much, Professor Martinez and Professor Riva, for being here today with us.
Yeah, thank you again for the suggestion. We know what to read next, but thank you also because we touched upon several different topics, and we thank you really for the interesting and engaging conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.